Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're diving into
Oh, yeah.
a really fascinating work, The Search for Modern China by Jonathan Spence.
It's a classic.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's a sweeping historical narrative. It covers over 3 centuries, from the Ming dynasty's fall in 1644 to the late 20th century.
You know what I really love about this book is how Spence, he masterfully weaves together political intrigue, social upheaval, intellectual movements, and this constant clash between tradition and change. It's really captivating how he highlights this recurring theme of China's search for a modern identity, one that can reconcile its glorious past with the demands of a rapidly evolving world.
Yeah. Before we embark on this chronological journey, could you give us a quick overview of the main themes that Spence explores? What are some of the key threads that we should be looking out for as we delve into this book?
Sure. So, one major theme that kind of runs through the whole book is the tension between central authority and regional power. From the Manchu conquest to the warlord era, China's rulers, they constantly grappled with this challenge of maintaining control over this vast and diverse land. Another really important recurring theme is the impact of the West. Spence meticulously traces how interactions with Europe, and later the United States, shaped China's economic and political and even intellectual landscape.
It sounds like we're going to be exploring how China attempted to balance its own traditions and values with the pressures of modernization and globalization, a theme that resonates even today.
Oh, absolutely. And Spence doesn't shy away from the complexities. He really delves into the successes and failures of various reform movements,
Hmm.
the rise of nationalism, and the often tragic consequences of revolutionary change. It's a story filled with remarkable individuals from emperors to revolutionaries to ordinary people caught in the currents of history.
I'm hooked. Let's rewind back to the 17th century. The Ming dynasty is on its last legs, plagued by corruption, economic woes, and powerful rebellions. Can you kind of paint a picture of what China looked like during this period of decline?
Imagine a China where the once mighty Ming dynasty is crumbling from within. Rampant corruption has eroded the government's legitimacy. Economic hardship has fueled widespread discontent. And then you have these charismatic rebel leaders like Li Zicheng, this former postal worker, who taps into the people's anger and rallies them against the Ming.
Li Zicheng's capture of Beijing and the subsequent suicide of the Chongzhen emperor in 1644. It marks the dramatic end of the Ming dynasty. It's a truly pivotal moment in Chinese history.
Oh, it's a moment of chaos and opportunity.
Yeah.
The Ming's collapse creates this power vacuum, and various factions are vying for control, but lurking in the wings are the Manchus, this powerful force from the northeast, who have been watching these events unfold with great interest.
The Manchus, led by this brilliant strategist Dorgan, seize this opportunity and they make a surprising alliance with a disgruntled Ming general named Wu Sangui. This is where things get really interesting. What was the story behind this alliance? Was it purely strategic, or were there more personal motives at play?
Well, both factors were definitely in place. Strategically, the Manchus needed someone like Wu Sangui, who commanded a powerful army and controlled these key access points to China proper. But the personal dimension adds this layer of intrigue. Spence recounts how Li Zicheng had allegedly abducted Wu Sangui's favorite concubine, Chen Yuan.
A stolen concubine leading to the fall of an empire. That's the stuff of legends.
It certainly captures the imagination. Spence uses these kinds of vivid anecdotes to bring history to life, to show us that grand historical events are often driven by very human motivations.
So with Wu Sangui's help, the Manchus crushed Li Zicheng's rebellion and established the Qing dynasty in 1644. But establishing control over a vast empire like China, that was no easy feat.
You're absolutely right. The Manchus, being an ethnic minority, faced this daunting task of legitimizing their rule and consolidating power over a predominantly Han Chinese population.
Spence highlights how the Manchus were incredibly shrewd in their approach. They didn't just conquer. They aimed to integrate themselves into the existing power structures. They retained many Ming officials, adopted Chinese administrative practices, and established the banner system, which integrated military and social organization.
The banner system is a fascinating aspect of Qing rule. It divided Manchu, Mongol, and Han Chinese bannermen into military units that were also responsible for social and administrative duties. This system helped the Manchus maintain military dominance while also creating a multi-ethnic ruling class.
But even with these strategies, the early Qing emperors faced significant challenges. They had to deal with rebellions and uprisings, particularly from those who still yearned for a return to Ming rule.
Yeah, the transition wasn't seamless. One major challenge came from the three feudatories, these powerful Han Chinese generals who had been given vast territories in southern China. as a reward for their support during the Manchu conquest. These feudatories, including Wu Sungui himself, posed a significant threat to Qing authority.
This is where Emperor Kangxi, who ruled from 1661 to 1722, steps onto the stage. Spence paints him as a truly remarkable figure, intelligent, decisive, and utterly ruthless when necessary. How did Kingxi deal with the threat posed by the three feudatories?
Kenki was a master strategist. He launched a series of military campaigns, skillfully playing the feudatories against each other, while also offering amnesty to those who surrendered. He ultimately crushed the rebellion, consolidating Qing control over all of China.
I remember Spence describing Kangxi's use of palace memorials, these secret reports from trusted officials. That allowed him to bypass the bureaucracy and get a direct pulse on what was happening throughout the empire. What was so significant about this system?
The palace memorial system was a powerful tool for Kangxi. It gave him access to unfiltered information, allowing him to monitor officials, gauge public sentiment, and make informed decisions. It also reveals Kangxi's deep interest in Confucianism. He saw himself as a benevolent ruler responsible for the welfare of his people.
So while Kangxi was solidifying king rule, another major force was shaping China's destiny. This dramatic population boom. China's population nearly doubled during the Qing dynasty, which must have had enormous social and economic consequences.
Oh, you're absolutely right. This population explosion put immense pressure on land, resources, and social structures. It led to increased competition for land and jobs, migration to new areas, and even contributed to social unrest in some regions.
But amidst these challenges, there was also a fascinating intellectual movement taking shape, the Kaozheng movement. Can you tell us more about this movement and how it challenged traditional ways of thinking?
The Qing movement was this shift towards empirical research and textual analysis. These scholars emphasized evidence-based scholarship, challenging the more abstract philosophical interpretations of Confucianism that had dominated intellectual life for centuries.
It seems like the Kaozheng movement was driven by this desire for accuracy and a belief in the power of observation and evidence. It's fascinating to see how these intellectual currents were flowing, even as the empire was grappling with political and social challenges.
It highlights the dynamism of Chinese intellectual life. Even within this seemingly rigid Confucian framework, there was room for debate, innovation, and new ways of understanding the world.
We've seen how the Qing dynasty established its rule, dealt with internal rebellions, and navigated this period of rapid population growth and intellectual ferment. But on the horizon looms a new challenge, the growing presence of the West.
That's right. As we move into the 18th century, China's interactions with Europe, particularly through trade, become increasingly significant and will eventually lead to a major turning point in China's search for modernity.
That's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned as we explore how China grapples with this growing Western presence and the challenges it brings.
So as the 18th century unfolds, China finds itself increasingly entangled with the West. European demand for Chinese goods, particularly for tea and silk and porcelain, is skyrocketing.
And this led to a rather curious trade imbalance, didn't it?
Yeah.
The Europeans were desperate for Chinese products, but the Chinese weren't particularly interested in much of what Europe had to offer.
Exactly. The Chinese economy was largely self-sufficient, and they viewed European goods as well somewhat inferior. This led to a situation where European traders were forced to pay for Chinese goods with silver, draining their treasuries.
Spence describes how the Qing dynasty had this very specific system for managing foreign trade, the Canton system. Can you tell us a bit more about how this system worked and what it reveals about China's worldview at the time?
Sure. So the Canton system was designed to limit European trade to a single port canton and to control interactions between Chinese and foreign merchants. Foreigners were subject to strict regulations and weren't allowed to venture beyond designated areas. It was a way for the king to manage this growing trade while maintaining their sense of superiority and control.
It's fascinating how this system reflects the traditional Chinese view of themselves as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, with all other nations existing on the periphery.
Yes, and this worldview would have a profound impact on how China responded to the growing Western presence. They saw themselves as the givers of civilization and culture, not the receivers.
But this carefully constructed system started to crumble when the British East India Company found a new product to sell to the Chinese: opium. This was a game changer, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Opium grown in British India became a highly sought-after commodity in China, creating a huge market for the British and reversing the flow of silver. But it also had devastating social consequences. Opium addiction spread rapidly. leading to widespread social problems and economic decline.
The Qing government was understandably alarmed by the opium trade's impact. They tried to crack down on smuggling and even destroyed large quantities of confiscated opium, which ultimately led to the Opium War in 1839.
Yeah, the Opium War was a clash of empires, a collision between two very different worldviews and military capabilities. The British, with their superior naval power, easily defeated the Qing forces, exposing the weaknesses of the Chinese military and the Qing dynasty's inability to defend its sovereignty.
The resulting Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 was a humiliation for China. It forced the Qing to cede Hong Kong to the British, open up more ports for trade, and grant extraterritoriality to British citizens, meaning they were subject to British law, not Chinese law.
The Opium War marked a turning point in China's relationship with the West. It shattered the illusion of Chinese superiority and exposed the vulnerabilities of a system that had clung to tradition in the face of a rapidly changing world.
It also seems to have triggered a wave of internal unrest and rebellion. People began to question the legitimacy of the Qing dynasty, and the empire was looking increasingly fragile.
Precisely. The Opium War's defeat, combined with this ongoing economic hardship and social discontent, created fertile ground for rebellion. One of the most significant of these was the Taiping Rebellion, which erupted in 1850.
The Taiping Rebellion was led by Hong Xiuquan, this fascinating and somewhat eccentric figure who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. What were the Taipings fighting for, and how did their vision for China differ from that of the Qing?
The Taipings had this radical vision for a new China. They called for the overthrow of the Qing, the abolition of private property, land redistribution, equality between men and women, and even the adoption of a form of Christianity heavily influenced by Hong Xiuquan's unique interpretations.
It sounds like a completely different vision for China, a radical departure from the Confucian order that had defined Chinese society for centuries.
It was a revolutionary movement, and it managed to gain control of large parts of China, establishing their capital in Nanjing in 1853. The Taiping Rebellion posed this serious threat to the Qing dynasty, and it took over a decade of brutal warfare for the Qing to finally crush the rebellion in 1864.
The Taiping Rebellion was a devastating conflict that left millions dead and further weakened the Qing dynasty. But it also highlighted the deep-seated problems within Chinese society and the growing desire for change.
Yes, and in response to these challenges, both internal and external, a new movement emerged within the Qing government, the self-strengthening movement. This movement sought to modernize China's military and industry while still retaining traditional Confucian values.
It sounds like a balancing act, trying to adopt Western technology and ideas without completely abandoning Chinese traditions. Who were some of the key figures in this movement, and what were they hoping to achieve?
Figures like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang emerged as leaders of the self-strengthening movement. They believed that China needed to adopt Western military technology and industrial methods to compete on the world stage. They oversaw the construction of arsenals and shipyards and railways, and they even sent students abroad to study Western science and engineering.
But this movement faced resistance, didn't it? Not everyone within the Qing court was convinced that embracing Western ideas was the right path for China.
There was significant opposition from conservative factions within the Qing government, who saw Westernization as a threat to Chinese culture and values. They argued that China should focus on its own strengths and traditions rather than imitating the West.
This tension between tradition and change, between embracing the new and clinging to the old, seems to be a recurring theme throughout Chinese history.
It's a constant struggle, and it would become even more pronounced as China faced further humiliation on the world stage.
You're referring to the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, right?
Right.
This was a devastating defeat for China and a major blow to the self-strengthening movement's efforts.
Yeah, the Sino-Japanese War was a short but decisive conflict that exposed the limitations of the self-strengthening movement. Japan, which had undergone its own rapid modernization, easily defeated the Chinese forces, taking control of Taiwan and demonstrating its growing power in the region.
This defeat had profound consequences for China. It led to even louder calls for reform and a growing sense of national humiliation.
The defeat shattered any remaining illusions of Chinese superiority and highlighted the urgent need for fundamental change. It also fueled a growing sense of nationalism, as intellectuals and activists began to grapple with the question of how China could regain its strength and reclaim its place in the world.
This period also sees the emergence of reformers like Kang Youwei and Liang Yikou, who advocated for a more radical approach to modernization. Can you tell us a bit about their ideas and how they differed from the self-strengthening movement?
Sure. So Kang Yue and Liang Qikao were part of this new generation of reformers who believed that China needed more than just technological and military modernization. They argued for sweeping political and social reforms, including the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, the abolition of the Confucian examination system, and the application of Western ideas about democracy and individual rights.
These were radical ideas for their time, a significant departure from the more cautious approach of the self-strengthening movement.
They were challenging the very foundations of the Qing dynasty and its Confucian ideology, and their ideas found a receptive audience among young intellectuals and students who were eager for change and disillusioned with the king's inability to address China's growing problems.
This leads to a brief but fascinating episode in 1898 known as the 100 Days Reform. Can you tell us more about what happened during this period and why it ultimately failed?
So the Hundred Days Reform was this whirlwind of activity as the young Guangxu emperor, influenced by Pang Yue and other reformers, issued a series of edicts aimed at transforming China's political, educational, and economic
It
systems.
sounds like a period of immense hope and excitement, a moment when it seemed like China might be on the verge of truly transformative change.
It was a moment of possibility, but it was short-lived. Empress Dowager Cixi, the powerful aunt of the emperor, who had been the real power behind the throne for decades, saw these reforms as a threat to her authority and to the traditional order.
And of course, she wasn't about to let that happen.
Exactly. Cixi staged a coup, placing the Guangxu emperor under house arrest and reversing most of the reforms. Kang Yue and Liang Qikao fled into exile, and the Hundred Days Reform came to an abrupt and tragic end.
The failure of the 100 Days Reform was a major setback for the reform movement and a sign of the deep resistance to change within the Qing dynasty.
It highlighted the entrenched power of conservative forces and the fragility of any attempt to challenge the status quo. But despite this setback, the seeds of change had been sown, and the desire for a modern China would continue to grow in the years to come.
And as we enter the 20th century, China faces yet another wave of upheaval, this time fueled by a combination of anti-foreign sentiment and domestic discontent.
You're referring to the Boxer Uprising, which erupted in 1900.
Right.
The Boxers, a secret society that blended martial arts, folk religion, and anti-foreign sentiment, launched a violent campaign against foreigners and Chinese Christians.
They attacked missionary outposts, besieged foreign legations in Beijing, and even challenged the authority of the Qing government itself.
The Boxer Uprising was a complex and multifaceted event. It was fueled by resentment towards foreign encroachment, anger over economic hardship, and a desire to restore China's lost glory. It also exposed the Qing dynasty's growing weakness and inability to maintain order.
The Boxer Uprising ultimately led to a multinational military intervention, further humiliation for China, and heavy indemnities imposed on the Qing government.
It was another blow to the king's already tarnished prestige and further weakened their hold on power. The empire was teetering on the brink of collapse, and within a few years a revolution would sweep them aside, ushering in a new era for China.
This brings us to the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, which marks the end of the Qing dynasty and the beginning of the Republican era. What were the key factors that led to this revolution, and what were the hopes and aspirations of those who overthrew the king?
The Xinhai Revolution was the culmination of decades of discontent and a growing desire for change. It was fueled by anger over foreign interference, frustration with the king's corruption and incompetence, and the inspiration of revolutionary ideas from the West. Figures like Sun Yat-sen, who had been advocating for the overthrow of the king for years, emerged as leaders of this movement.
Sun Yat-sen is often hailed as the father of modern China. What was his vision for a new China? And how did he envision the country's future after the fall of the king?
Sun Yat-sen envisioned a modern, democratic, and unified China free from foreign domination, and based on the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. He believed that China needed to overthrow the monarchy, establish a republican government, and modernize its economy and society.
The Xinhai Revolution was a momentous event marking the end of centuries of imperial rule and the birth of a new China. But as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, the journey to modernity would be a long and tumultuous one, filled with challenges, setbacks, and unexpected twists and turns. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911 may have toppled the Qing dynasty, but the road to a modern China was far from paved. The early years of the Republic were marked by political instability, economic woes, and the looming presence of warlords vying for power.
Yeah, the fall of the king didn't magically solve China's problems. It simply ushered in a new set of challenges. The Republican government, led initially by Sun Yat-sen and later by Yuan Shikai, struggled to establish its authority and unify this fractured nation.
So Sun Yat-sen, despite being hailed as the father of modern China, faced an uphill battle from the get-go. What were some of the key obstacles that prevented him from fully realizing his vision for a unified and democratic China?
Well, one major obstacle was the lack of a strong centralized military. Sun Yat-sen was a revolutionary and a visionary, but he wasn't a military leader. This led him to make this fateful compromise with Yuan Shikai, a powerful general who controlled a significant army. Sun hoped that Yuan would help stabilize the country and pave the way for democratic reforms.
That sounds like a risky gamble, placing your trust in a powerful general when your goal is to establish a democracy. It's a bit like putting a fox in charge of the henhouse.
It was a gamble that didn't pay off. Yuan Shikai, ambitious and power-hungry, quickly consolidated his control, dissolved the parliament, and even attempted to restore the monarchy with himself as emperor. This betrayal shattered the early hopes for a democratic republic and plunged China deeper into chaos.
Yuan Shikai's death in 1916 didn't exactly bring stability, did it? If anything, it seems like things went from bad to worse.
Absolutely. Yuan Shikai's demise led to an era of warlordism. With regional military leaders carving up the country and battling for control, it was a period of fragmentation, violence, and political instability that further hampered China's efforts to modernize and unify.
It is fascinating, though, how amidst all this turmoil, there were still vibrant intellectual and cultural movements emerging. This is where we encounter the May 4th movement, which erupted in 1919. Can you tell us more about this movement and its significance in shaping modern Chinese thought?
The May 4th movement was a student-led protest. It was sparked by the Treaty of Versailles, which granted Japan control over German territories in China, a decision that many Chinese viewed as a betrayal. Thousands of students took to the streets, denouncing imperialism, calling for national rejuvenation, and demanding a stronger, more modern China.
It sounds like this movement was about more than just a single treaty. It seems like it represented a broader awakening, a rejection of traditional values, and a search for new ideas and solutions to China's problems.
You're right. The May 4th movement had a profound cultural and intellectual impact. It led to a surge in nationalism, a questioning of Confucianism, and an embrace of new ideologies, including liberalism, feminism, and even Marxism.
This is also the period where we see the emergence of two major political forces that would shape China's destiny for decades to come: the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party. Can you tell us a bit about the origins of these parties and the ideologies they represented?
The Kuomintang, led by Sun Yat-sen's successor, Chiang Kai-shek, aimed to unify China under a nationalist government and modernize the country along capitalist lines. The Chinese Communist Party, inspired by Marxist-Leninist ideology, sought a more radical transformation of Chinese society, with a focus on class struggle, the overthrow of capitalism, and the establishment of a socialist state.
Initially, these two parties, despite their ideological differences, formed a united front in the mid-1920s. What was the motivation behind this alliance, and what were they hoping to achieve?
The primary goal of the United Front was to defeat the warlords and unify China under a single government. They launched the Northern Expedition in 1926. This military campaign that aimed to bring the warlord-controlled areas under the control of the nationalist government.
It sounds like a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But as we know, this alliance was short-lived and ended rather tragically.
You're right. The United Front collapsed in 1927. When Chiang Kai-shek, fearing the growing influence of the communists within the alliance, launched a bloody purge of communists and their supporters in Shanghai, known as the Shanghai Massacre.
This event marked the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, a brutal and protracted conflict that would dominate China's political landscape for the next 2 decades. Can you paint a picture of what this conflict looked like and the key strategies employed by both sides?
The Chinese Civil War was a complex and multifaceted conflict, fought on military, political, and ideological fronts. The Kuomintang, with its larger army and control over major cities, initially had the upper hand. But the communists, led by Mao Zedong, employed guerrilla warfare tactics, mobilizing the peasantry and establishing rural bases of support.
It's fascinating how Mao Zedong, through his military strategies and his political ideology, was able to adapt Marxism to the Chinese context.
Mao's theories on peasant-based revolution and his emphasis on guerrilla warfare proved to be highly effective against the Kuomintang's more conventional military tactics. He understood the importance of winning the support of the rural population and using the vast countryside as a base from which to wage this protracted war of attrition.
And then in 1931, this already complex conflict is further complicated by the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, a turning point that would have profound implications for both the Civil War and China's place in the world.
The Japanese invasion created a dilemma for both the Kuomintang and the Communists. On the one hand, they faced this existential threat from an aggressive and expansionist Japan. On the other hand, they were still locked in this bitter civil war.
So did they put aside their differences and form a united front against the Japanese? Or did they continue fighting each other while also trying to resist the invasion?
There were periods of uneasy cooperation, particularly in the early years of the war. But the underlying rivalry and distrust never fully disappeared. The Communists, under Mao's leadership, skillfully used the war to their advantage, portraying themselves as the true patriots resisting the Japanese, while accusing the Kuomintang of being more interested in fighting the Communists than in fighting the invaders.
It sounds like a classic case of turning a crisis into an opportunity.
It was a brilliant strategy. The Communists used the war to expand their influence, recruit new members, and gain the support of the peasantry, who saw them as the more effective force in resisting the Japanese.
And when the Japanese finally surrendered in 1945, the Chinese Civil War resumed with renewed intensity.
The Communists, battle-hardened and with widespread popular support, were now in a much stronger position, despite receiving significant aid from the United States. The Kuomintang was increasingly demoralized and plagued by corruption and internal divisions.
So by 1949, it was clear that the Communists had won. Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and his followers fled to Taiwan, and a new era had begun.
It was a monumental shift, a communist revolution in the most populous nation on earth. It marks the end of centuries of dynastic rule and the beginning of this bold experiment in socialist transformation.
The early years of the People's Republic were a time of radical change, as Mao and the Communist Party implemented their vision of a socialist China. What were some of the key social and economic transformations that took place during this period?
One of the most significant changes was land reform, which involved confiscating land from wealthy landlords and redistributing it to poor peasants. This was a key part of the Communist Party's strategy to win the support of the peasantry and break the power of the old elite.
It seems like a very symbolic act, aimed at not only changing economic structures, but also reshaping social relations and challenging traditional hierarchies.
Exactly. Land reform was both pragmatic and ideological. It was about addressing economic inequality and redistributing wealth. But it was also about empowering the peasantry and creating a more egalitarian society.
And then, of course, there was the Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958. This was Mao's attempt to rapidly industrialize China and catch up with the West. It involved collectivizing agriculture, mobilizing labor on a massive scale, and setting ambitious production targets.
The Great Leap Forward was a bold and ultimately tragic experiment. While it initially generated enthusiasm and a sense of collective purpose, it was poorly planned and executed, leading to widespread famine, economic disruption, and ultimately the deaths of millions of people.
It's a sobering reminder of the human cost of utopian schemes and the dangers of unchecked ambition.
The failure of the Great Leap Forward led to a period of retrenchment and self-criticism within the Communist Party, but it also sowed the seeds for a future upheaval, the Cultural Revolution.
The Cultural Revolution, which began in 1966, was a chaotic and tumultuous period. Mao, feeling that China was drifting away from its revolutionary ideals and becoming too bureaucratic, called on the masses, particularly young people, to purge the country of bourgeois influences and counter-revolutionaries.
The Cultural Revolution was a decade of political and social upheaval. Schools were closed, universities were shut down, intellectuals were persecuted, and countless people were imprisoned, exiled, or even killed. It was a dark period in Chinese history, leaving lasting scars on society and a legacy of trauma and distrust.
In the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, China entered a period of transition. Mao's death in 1976 led to a power struggle, and out of that struggle emerged Deng Xiaoping, this pragmatic leader who had been purged during the Cultural Revolution, but was now rehabilitated and determined to set China on a new course.
Deng Xiaoping initiated a series of economic reforms, opening up China to the world, encouraging foreign investment, and shifting from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented system. These reforms, known as the Four Modernizations, focused on agriculture, industry, science and technology, and national defense.
This was a dramatic shift away from Maoist ideology and towards a more pragmatic approach to economic development. It's fascinating how Deng Xiaoping, despite being a lifelong communist, was willing to embrace capitalist ideas and practices to modernize China's economy.
Deng was a pragmatist. He famously said, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." He believed that ideology should take a backseat to practical results. And his reforms, though controversial, led to an unprecedented period of economic growth and
Yeah.
transformed China into a global economic powerhouse.
But these economic reforms weren't accompanied by political reforms, were they?
Right.
The Communist Party maintained its tight grip on power, and any calls for democracy or greater political freedom were met with repression.
That's right. Deng Xiaoping was a reformer when it came to economics, but he was a staunch defender of the Communist Party's monopoly on power. He believed that political stability was essential for economic growth, and that China was not ready for Western-style democracy.
And this tension between economic liberalization and political control came to a head in 1989 with the pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square.
The Tiananmen Square protests were a culmination of growing frustration with corruption, inflation, and the lack of political freedom. Thousands of students and other citizens took to the streets, demanding democratic reforms and greater accountability from the government.
The world watched with bated breath as these protests unfolded, hoping that China might be on the verge of a political opening.
But the government, fearing a loss of control and a challenge to its authority, responded with brutal force. The military crackdown on June 4, 1989, was a tragedy that shocked the world and left a lasting stain on China's international image.
The Tiananmen Square massacre marked the end to any hope for political reform in the near future. It demonstrated the Communist Party's determination to maintain its grip on power, even at the cost of human life and international condemnation.
It was a pivotal moment, a turning point that shaped China's trajectory for decades to come. The government doubled down on political control, tightening censorship, cracking down on dissent, and focusing on economic growth as a way to legitimize its rule.
So as we reach the end of our journey through Jonathan Spence's The Search for Modern China, we're left with a sense of both awe and unease. We've witnessed centuries of dramatic transformation, from the fall of empires to the rise of communism, from the ravages of war to the triumphs of economic development.
Spence's book offers a nuanced and insightful look at China's complex and often contradictory journey towards modernity. He highlights the enduring tension between tradition and change, the challenges of balancing economic growth with political control, and this enduring search for a Chinese identity that can navigate the complexities of the modern world.
One thing that's clear is that China's story is far from over. As the country enters the 21st century as a global superpower, it faces new challenges and opportunities. The search for a modern China continues, and its outcome will have profound implications, not just for China, but for the entire world.
Spence leaves us with a sense of wonder, but also with a set of questions that we as engaged citizens of the world must grapple with. What does it mean for China to be modern? What are the costs and consequences of rapid economic growth? How will China balance its growing power with its authoritarian system? These are questions that will continue to shape our understanding of this fascinating and ever-evolving nation.
And on that note, we'll conclude our deep dive into Jonathan Spence's The Search for Modern China. It's been an incredible journey, and we hope you'll continue to explore the rich tapestry of Chinese history and engage with the challenges and opportunities that this remarkable country presents to the world. Thanks for joining us.